What's up, everybody? Ron Placone here. My movie, Left at Wall, is out now. We did a soft screening in San Pedro, California as part of the San Pedro International Film Festival, and we're having more screenings and events throughout the country and internationally as well. The first few screenings that have already been announced and confirmed: February 22nd, Tucson, Arizona; March 20th, Washington, D.C., March 22nd, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The event in Pittsburgh is a screening and a short stand-up show and a Q&A after, so I'll be there. You can get tickets and more information now at ronplacone.com. My movie is called Left at Wall, and it stars myself, Gareth Reynolds from The Dollop, Sarah K. Godot, Kimberly Hill. There are appearances by Sage Francis, Graham Elwood, Eddie Pepitone, Dave Anthony, Krish Moen. I'm so excited for you guys to see this movie. I really, truly am. So those first few screenings have already been announced. Again, that's February 22nd, Tucson, Arizona; March 20th, Washington, D.C., March 22nd, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We're going to be having a weekend of events in Sheffield out in the UK. We'll be announcing more and more as time goes on. But for those three screenings, you can get your tickets and more information right now over at ronplacone.com. Episode 10, Professor Gabriel Rockhill. Gabriel Rockhill is an academic, author, organizer, and activist. He is the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop, which operates both in the U.S. and in France. He's one of the few radical academics out there in the U.S. and an incredibly brilliant guy to talk to. In my opinion, he is one of the leading public intellectuals of our day. Professor Rockhill gives the best definition and analysis of fascism I've ever heard. Also, one disclaimer: when this interview was recorded, Cornel West was still running with the Green Party. He no longer is. That topic does come up in the interview, and while the theme is still relevant, at the time of this recording, Cornel West was still running for president as a Green. Also, I make a Lenin joke that doesn't connect, but hey, can't win them all. Please welcome to the show, Professor Gabriel Rockhill. So, Gabriel Rockhill, you are, first of all, are you still in academia? They have not forced you out yet.
Yeah, I'm still in academia.
Oh, that gives me a little bit, that makes me feel a little good, to be honest with you.
Me too. I've got to pay the bills. I've got kids. I mean, there's a lot of good reasons for me to be in academia.
Well, I just feel like, you know, I can count on one hand how many radical academics I know that are still in it, at least in this country, the U.S. And yeah, so whatever I know, like, okay, there's still Richard Wolff's still there, Gabriel Rockhill's still there. You know, there's still a handful that gives me a little bit of
Agreed.
hope.
And we need more of them.
Oh yeah. Well. So let's start there. I was an academic in a different lifetime. I got out after master's, and looking at the direction it's going, I mean, first of all, with the whole student loan crisis, I think that higher education in the United States, at least, is becoming solely reserved for the elite. I think it's incredibly dangerous. I think the state of the academy is just straight up frightening. I never thought it would get this bad. And this is coming from a guy who in 2012 kind of got out of the game. And one of the reasons was I feel like this is just a corporation with textbooks. So what is your take on the state of academia? Do you have hope for it in the United States going forward into the future, especially as somebody who does split their time abroad?
It's a complicated question because you're absolutely right. It's a corporation with textbooks, and also it's a real estate corporation and a corporation with investments. And so the U.S. Academy is bound up with the capitalist system very deeply, and it's also bound up with a history of U.S. imperialism and justifying that imperialism in various ways. And so I don't see a big kind of, how to put it, firewall between the academy and the rest of society, if it be the kind of social issues or politics and economics. And so the current state of the academy, I think, in the U.S. reflects in many ways the current state of the United States, which is an empire that is having a lot of trouble keeping itself stitched together due to the fact that capitalist crises are kind of ongoing at various levels, from, housing to unemployment to healthcare and everything else. And that is combined with a world situation that's very quickly changing because of the inability of the U.S. empire to exercise its dominion in the same way that it used to, at least, both militarily, economically, etc. And so I think within that broader context, the U.S. Academy is also kind of dwindling to a certain extent in its prominence internationally. I think it's within the last 2 or 3 years that the number of references to the top reviewed publications in the hard sciences, now the Chinese publications have surpassed U.S. publications or European publications. It's a very powerful, university system there. And I think that reflects as well a kind of dwindling on the part of the U.S. Academy. Maybe the last thing that I'd say is that in relationship to the general political state of affairs, it is somewhat interesting because there is, and that's where I have not only hope, because hope can be vapid and uninteresting, but a certain amount of materialist optimism, is that there's a lot of young people with interest in opening up the spectrum of ideas beyond the spectrum that I was introduced to as a student, which I'd refer to as kind of boomer ideology. There's this thing called capitalism. It's great. It's a free world, et cetera. And there's this other thing that's just awful. And it's called socialism or communism, or, people use different terms for it. And it's all just horrible and dictatorial and drenched in blood. Most young people today are faced with a world in which the capitalist world doesn't hold a future for them that is exactly like a shining path. And so they're looking elsewhere and opening up in various ways. And you see that both in students, grad students, young faculty. So I think that if there's a greater mobilization on the part of these people, then I think that we can begin to hopefully push the academy more in the direction of being what at least it says that it is, and that is that it's a free realm for the exploration of ideas. Well, let's explore all ideas, like ideas that might help us, seriously engage with the problems that we're faced with and actually put forth solutions that are real material solutions.
Well, then, to any future radical academics who are out there, what's your advice? How do you stay out of trouble? How do you find the good trouble and stay out of the bad kind?
Well, you have to navigate it like anything, like union organizers, like militants who are working various jobs, like lawyers who do their corporate job, but also are doing pro bono work on the side. Like being a class trader is something that a lot of people have expertise in above and beyond my own experiences. And I think that you have to try to, as much as possible, understand where the extant play of forces is, and not overstep certain bounds, because if you do, then you will be banished very quickly. And if you can maintain at least 1 foot within certain systems, because we could also talk about the entertainment industry, right? I know that you have a lot of experience and could talk at length about that. If you can keep a little toe or a foot within certain elements of the entertainment industry in order to be able to use it to your benefit while maintaining some level of integrity and some principles while doing that, then you might be able to use the kind of power of the monster against itself, so to speak. Well, at the same time, I would say, actually, I'm working on a book right now with Jennifer Ponce de Leon where we spell some of this out. I think there are really 3 tactics that cultural producers use. One is the one that I just mentioned, is that a kind of Trojan horse. Like you use the institution or the entertainment industry and you try to smuggle in a different message, but you use its enormous power to get your message across, which I do with the university or with publishing houses or journal publications and things like this. But another very important thing is to develop an alternative apparatus, our own system of production, circulation, and consumption of ideas and of culture. And I run the Critical Theory Workshop, which is an educational nonprofit. I began in 2008. That's one of our goals, is to have our own system of operations. And the third is ultimately leveraging power fully away from the capitalist system by establishing a kind of socialist apparatus that is such that the production of culture is in the hands of the people instead of the hands of the corporate overlords. So those are at least 3 tactics that I think are particularly important, and we can do all 3 or support all 3 at the same time.
Do you consider yourself a class trader?
If by class trader we mean someone who would be objectively situated as a member of the professional managerial class stratum in the imperial core, which most people would identify a university professor like myself as being, while at the same time politically, socially situating myself on the side of the oppressed and exploited masses of humanity on planet Earth, then yes, absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah. See, I don't know if I would put university professor in there, but I guess it's all just a judgment call, right?
Well, it depends on the kind of nature of class analysis, though, too. Mm-hmm. And university professors, at least historically, have often been situated within that professional managerial class stratum. Some of them are paid it's not my case, but some of them are paid extremely well in order to produce the dominant ideology and to go on TV shows and back the, U.S. intervention in the Ukraine, or, U.S. backed proxy war in the Ukraine, or other such things. Many others are paid a little bit less just to try to basically indoctrinate the next generation into the dominant ideology. And so I understand the professional managerial class stratum as a kind of buffer between the capitalist ruling class that owns the means of production, the means of communication, the means of distribution, and on the other hand, all the people who are working to actually produce the values in society, the goods and services. And so the PMC stratum is, they're working for the overlords, and a lot of them like to have the illusion that they're nonetheless on the right side of history and they're serving the general population, et cetera. But it's very rare, as you said in your kind of critique of the lack of radical academics, it's very rare to find people that are actually materially invested in being on the side of the people. Most of them are invested in creating the illusion that they're on the side of the people so they can benefit from all of the symbolic rewards that go along with that.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I like that. That's a cool way of unpacking it. So my next question, ironically enough, you kind of led into it, but I wanted to ask you more specifically about critical theory and the critical theory workshop. You already touched upon it naturally. So I guess, instead of just delivering my next question, I'll just say, could you go into a little more detail about the critical theory and the critical theory workshop? What is it exactly?
Well, critical theory historically was developed in Europe as a kind of, at its best version is an attempt to make theory relevant to real social and political struggles. That history, particularly within the European context, has been such that many of the self-proclaimed critical theorists, if your viewers and listeners are familiar with Adorno and Horkheimer of the Frankfurt School, or of major French theorists like Michel Foucault or Jacques Derrida or others of this sort, I have argued in my scholarship that they failed in that task, meaning that they generally have not produced meaningful theories that help elucidate the world and orient working people. They've instead engaged largely in obscurantism and often in capitalist accommodation and even imperialist support. And so the work that I've been doing with the Critical Theory Workshop as an educational nonprofit is to try to kind of put the substance back into critical theory and to mobilize the world of ideas for its real use value to working people. So we shouldn't just be, constructing elaborate word bridges and kind of colossal theoretical constructs in our minds that are so obtuse that average people can't understand them. We should instead be using the time and resources that we have as academics, for instance, in order to investigate the real nature of the world and unpack it in such a way that it can be explainable to the masses of workers, many of whom don't have that luxury, right? Because prior to being an academic, I spent a lot of time working construction or other odd jobs. And you come home from work, you're exhausted. Are you going to sit down and crack a 700-page book on the history of capitalism? Hopefully, but it would be much better if you could find a little compendium written by a radical academic that in 20 or 25 pages would explain the history of capitalism in a way that's accessible and that's actionable as well, so that you can not only understand the world, but ultimately contribute to transforming it in a more egalitarian direction.
Well, I just think that's such valuable work, especially today. When you look at something like the online left and things like that, there's a certain stigma that exists because there is, there is a portion of people that just, oh, let's just read theory, and then when we're done, read more theory. And there's a certain frustration where it's been like, well, have you ever shown up to anything? Have you ever? When's the last time you left your basement? And then on the same note, there's just the notion that, but this theory is valuable. These books have a lot of value that can be applied in the struggles we face now. So I mean, as an individual, I find myself a little bit in between, and I'd imagine you do as well. So have you found that it's been successful in building that bridge?
Definitely. The way I would describe it is that there's a difference between theory that has exchange value, meaning theory that is marketable, trendy, hip, gets lots of likes on social media, sells a lot of books. Slavoj Žižek would be a good example of that, and he's a pseudo-theorist whom I have attacked quite directly on this front, because I'd juxtapose theory with exchange value, theory that can be monetized, to theory with use value. Michael Parenti would be a great example of someone who has really done an excellent job of elucidating the history of U.S. politics, and for that matter, foreign affairs as well, in such a way that average people can understand it and they can act on it. And in my own experience, I was trained originally in a very highfalutin form of obtuse French theory, and did my PhD in France under some of the kind of leading luminaries of these traditions. So what I was supposed to do with my life is become a kind of guru in this exchange value driven theory world. And it wasn't working out because I kept reading this theory. And given that I have a working class background, I grew up on a farm, I've always been invested in radical politics, I wanted to make it relevant. And it just became increasingly clear to me that it was completely irrelevant. And my work over the last, I don't know how long it's been now, maybe 6 to 10 years, has really pivoted much more clearly to theory with use value. And the rewards are obvious in the sense that I've been involved with a whole series of activist campaigns that have been successful. I've been involved in public political education that has been very successful. And I've also just really connected with both my roots and where I'm coming from and other working class people and young people who are facing a world where they need ideas and they need theory, because you have to be able to frame your experience in a broader world, right? You can't just, if you just go through the world and you're, on social media and stopping by 7-Eleven to get coffee and, you don't have a higher view on what it exactly is that you're experiencing it and why the world is the way that it is. And so you need theory in order to do that. And I'm a very, very strong believer in the power of theory to abstract from the immediacy of our experience so that you can, situate your consumer experience within something like capitalism, and capitalism within the deep history of the colonial expansion of Europe and other such things.
Hold on. I think my cat wants to get on the lap here.
All right.
She wants to say hi. I don't know if you could hear her, but are you a cat guy too?
I don't have cats, but I love cats and I love dogs. I don't really choose much between them because my sons both really love dogs. So
I love them both too, but but I have a cat. But yeah, well, Lucy says hi. But I think also like going on your answer, right, you do show by example somebody who can talk the theory, but you also walk the walk constantly, which I want to kind of get into. But first, what does it mean to you when you say I am a communist? What does that mean, especially in 2023?
Well, it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So the way that I would put it is that if you know the history of capitalism, then you should know that there has been a world historical struggle that is now centuries old to overcome capitalism by establishing an alternative socioeconomic and political system. And that social and economic system and the political system is based, at least in principle, on the maximization of equality. so that the economic means of production wouldn't be owned by corporate overlords. They would be owned by the people. And that politically, that would lead, at least over time, to an increased substantive democratization. And in that regard, it is, the term communism can lend itself to some misunderstandings. The world that we're in right now is not a world of communism. It's a world of socialism. And socialism is the struggle to overcome the capitalist system and begin establishing the foundations for a more egalitarian society. And at this point in history, we're in the preliminary stages of this. Capitalism, depending on who you read and how you situate yourself in these debates, took many centuries to develop out of feudalism. And there are still feudal remnants within the capitalist world system. And so we're only about 100 years into the socialist project. And for me in 2023, it means being a supporter of the very hard, difficult struggle to develop socialism out of a dominant system, which is capitalism currently, in order to establish not only a more egalitarian world, but another big part of the long history of socialism is a more ecologically sustainable world so that human beings in the natural world, including your cat, can live in greater harmony than the world that we currently have, which is a world in which the ecological collapse is already upon us and is getting more and more intensified due to the way in which capitalism maximizes profit at the expense not only of people, but also of nature.
Well, Lucy says thank you.
Good.
And, although I gotta say, despite the world's problems, she has a pretty good life. This cat has it. She has free reign of literally everything, and really, she's in charge. She lets my wife and I live here, but this is her place.
Does she pay the rent?
No. We do that too.
Darn.
She's really cracked the system, but she.
Well, I'm glad you're inverting the relationship between human beings and nature by making sure that nature is primary, because we're part of nature at the end of the day.
No kidding,
so it
right?
makes sense.
Do you think that we are getting away from capitalism as a society?
The U.S. society? Or
the U.S. society and just the bigger society of the world. I mean, you're talking about how we're trying to get away from the capitalist mindset. Do you think that is happening?
I think that the current moment is characterized by an inability to resolve capitalist crises combined with a very clear emergence of what many people call a multipolar world. And the multipolar world, meaning a world in which there is not a unipolar dominance by U.S. capitalism or U.S. style capitalism, is a world that is characterized, amongst other things, by very clear leadership on the part of China. China is a socialist country. And in that regard, many people see, and I think that this is a correct analysis, the multipolar world is a way of breaking up U.S.-driven imperialism in order to create more space for the flourishing and further development of socialism. So in the broad kind of world historical perspective, I do see advances being made on the front of imperialism not being able to maintain the forms of hegemony that it had in the past, or partial hegemony because it was never complete, and an increasing development of socialism or socialistically oriented forms of governance around the world. In the case of the US, it's a little bit more complicated, given that it's the leading empire and that it has arguably one of the most reactionary political cultures around the world. I do think that there is a very strong presence of an interest in socialism, particularly amongst young people. And this has been statistically proven, right? If you look at various polls about whether or not people identify as socialist or even communist, they've been going up. And so I do think that within the US context, there's a lot of interest on the part of the youth and also just other disenfranchised populations with opening up the spectrum of analysis beyond the kind of boomer ideology and engaging seriously with socialism, and a lot more socialist activism going on, which I take it to be a net positive.
Would you consider yourself an optimist?
Optimism and pessimism often tend to relate to kind of, how to put it, psychological states. And
Okay.
I'm much more in favor of objective analysis as much as possible, right? The only way of making it an objective analysis is through the point of view of a subject, of course.
Sure.
But often if one thinks only, I'm an optimist or I'm a pessimist, one is thinking subjectively about how I orient myself in relationship to the world. So I would say that I'm an objective optimist in the sense that, objectively speaking, I do not see the possibility of the capitalist system continuing to maintain itself over time. And that we're in a world now where I think it's very clear that it's the end of capitalism or the end of us, right? Either through nuclear apocalypse or through the ecological collapse or, some other horrific version of, World War III without nukes or something like this, but something rather horrific. And that in that regard, the socialist project that has been struggling in fits and starts to emerge since, 1917, at least in material form, is a project that is going to continue to galvanize. And I would anticipate increasingly galvanize people. But we have to look at that in a global perspective, because at the same time, what you clearly have within capitalist countries, particularly within the imperialist core, is a resurgence of fascism. And so with the crises of capitalism and the inability on the part of the ruling class to take care of these crises, because they're irresolvable ultimately, the propagandists, as well as the capitalist ruling class, have a well-known, tried and true solution to that. And that is to try to do a kind of bait and switch where they bait people into various fascist forms of politics that ultimately have the goal of shoring up the capitalist system and intensifying imperialism. And so in the US context, we also have very powerful fascist organizations, and we have a government and a capitalist ruling class that either work hand in glove with the fascists or at least accommodate and maintain their presence because they always want to keep their bogeyman kind of on call for when push comes to shove and they need to crush the socialist alternative by any means necessary.
When you say fascist, like who would you define as the fascist organizations?
Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, the militia movement, the white power movement, the Klan, of course, the deep history of one of the things that's interesting is when the Italian fascists first arrived on the scene and then the term fascism was introduced into the English language via the Italian language, many in the US recognized that the Italian fascists were simply a European version of the Klan because they were pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist, anti-socialist, and they were doing the vigilante work that was allowed by the government, when we're talking about the black shirts, for instance, in the exact same way that the KKK was often allowed to act with impunity on the part of organizations like the FBI or the police or other forms of law enforcement within the United States. And so I think there is a very well-documented history of fascist organizations. The thing that's, I think, difficult but important to analyze is that fascism comes in many different forms. It's not just swastikas and jackboots. We have plenty of that. Look at the Ukraine or look elsewhere, or in the United States. Plenty of people with swastika tattoos here. But given that fascism often takes on ultra-nationalist forms, Dimitrov, the famous communist analyst of fascism, claimed that when fascism arrives in the United States, it will arrive draped in the American flag and singing hymns to patriotism. Right? It'll all be about U.S. exceptionalism, et cetera. It'd be MAGA, Make America Great Again. Right? Yeah. And so in that regard, there is a very important fascist movement in the United States. And in the wake of January 6th, with Biden coming into office, there was not a serious crackdown on these organizations. There was a kind of propaganda campaign and a need to at least do something. And so you have some of the heads of these organizations who just recently received prison terms going up to, I believe, between 15, maybe 18 years is the maximum sentence, which is about half of what they the prosecutors were seeking. And the organizations have not been shut down and continue to operate, even though some of the leadership has run into some legal problems. So it's alive and well in the United States for sure. And a real danger, of course, to socialist organizing, because one of the main goals of fascism is to crush the real opponents of capitalism, who are the socialists, the communists, the anarchists, anyone basically who's on the hard left.
So in the electoral realm, then, I mean, those groups you name, I mean, they are, very much like wearing it on the sleeve. Literally, in most cases, they usually have some sort of decor on their sleeves. But getting into the electoral realm, like I would say, I consider Ron DeSantis a straight up Nazi. I think that guy is the most dangerous person in American politics, second to none. If he were to ever enter the White House, I've already talked to my wife about it. I want to get out of this country as soon as we safely can. Trump, I think Trump's just a freaking narcissist who has like no ideology whatsoever. Not saying he isn't dangerous. I just think he's just a narcissistic loon. And then getting into the other side of it, I mean, it's like you look at a lot of fascistic, by definition, policies that are pushed by corporate Democrats like Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg. So do you think there's any alternative right now in the electoral realm?
Not amongst the Democrats and the Republicans, because I couldn't agree more that if you want to analyze fascism, you have to do it internationally. And you see this very clearly with the U.S. undying support for what is basically a totalitarian regime in the Ukraine controlled by Zelensky, and the funding of fascist battalions that have been this funding has, and the battalions themselves has been extremely well documented. And so regardless of whether or not it's a Democrat or Republican who comes into office, U.S. imperialism and the U.S. support of fascism internationally will continue. All right. So that's a negative. Regarding fascism domestically, I think that we have to, and George Jackson's a great analyst on this front, identify at least two different forms of fascism. One is just the nature of the U.S. police state and the mass incarceration system, everything that goes into the kind of quote unquote legal fascism. And that will continue unabated. Again, whether or not it's a Democrat or a Republican, we see this very clearly with Biden's longstanding history of supporting racist policies, being involved in the mass incarceration system, et cetera, et cetera. The fascist movements are a third element to that, like the movements that were empowered by Trump that I mentioned a moment ago. If Trump, someone like DeSantis, comes into office, then we are looking at a significant uptick in that type of activity. And that means that I think it would be increasingly dangerous for various forms of organizing, whether or not it be, labor organizing or social movement organizing or other such things within the U.S. context. And it also depends on what exactly that will look like over time, because fascists historically have come into, like full-blooded fascists have come into office largely as opportunists who have been bankrolled by the capitalist ruling class or segments of the capitalist ruling class who are looking to solve the problem of how to increase capitalist accumulation and beat back the socialist threat. And it's clear within the U.S. context that there are segments of the capitalist ruling class that support a kind of fascist option, a more directly fascist option, in the sense of supporting presidential candidates that would support these fascist movements and potentially also increase the two other forms of fascism that I mentioned, both imperialist fascism and the kind of fascist police state. And so one of the conundrums right now, I think, for some of the capitalist ruling class is what to do when faced with the fact that you do have an empire that is facing various forms of decadence, meaning various ways in which it's kind of coming apart at the seams. How do you shore that up? Well, one of them is you look at historical examples and you follow them. And in fact, in 1934, this is exactly what a group of Democrats did who were anti-FDR. They collaborated with J.P. Morgan and a whole series of other members of the capitalist ruling class and they made plans for a fascist coup d'etat, in which they studied Hitler, Mussolini, and examples of fascism within France. And we now know through the business plot, this is all part of the public record, that there was a conspiracy to establish a fascist dictatorship. That was the term that was used within the United States. And so we shouldn't think by any stretch of the imagination that somehow we're immune to these types of politics.
So staying in the electoral realm for just a minute, and I don't want to harp on it too long, but can third parties build power in the United States? And if so, how?
Well, the whole system is set up to make sure that that doesn't happen, right? And we've seen time and again the way in which we don't have a true democracy in the United States. We have an oligarchic republic that is controlled by the capitalist ruling class and that tries to ensure that any party formation that would be on the side of the people is completely excluded from the possibility of power and even from public debate. Right now, of course, we'll see what happens with the most recent, I think, probably most prominent instantiation thereof, and that is Cornel West now running for the Green Party, right? Mm-hmm. Cornel West is a social democrat who is dedicated to certain progressive positions that are markedly different than anything that we see on the part of the Democrats and the Republicans. He was involved in the Sanders campaign, has his, critiques to the left of Sanders. He also is a believer and can mobilize a kind of Christian base in a very, very interesting way. The Democratic Party has already started, as we saw with Sanders' positions and whatnot, what is sure to be one of the most heinous slander campaigns against West, probably in the history of electoral politics. And so we'll see how this plays out. I assume I'm not privy to and part of these internal discussions, of course, although I did have the pleasure of interviewing Cornel West years ago. I assume that one of the main reasons that he's running is not based on the assumption that the Green Party can get on enough ballots in enough states to actually be able to vote him into office, but so that he can occupy a position that can hopefully help change part of the conversation in the United States, like the Sanders campaign, for all of its ultimate failings, did in various ways, because it made socialism into something that was no longer a bad word. And so in that regard, I think that West's contributions, we'll see how they play out, are promising for, at a minimum, changing the nature of the conversation. And we'll see perhaps more than that. But I think we have to remain, cautiously, optimistic in the sense of the objective optimism that I was talking about. We have to look at the actual extant play of forces. And it would be quite surprising if West was able to be voted into office.
Do you think the left as a whole is in a better place than it was prior to 2016, or in a worse one?
The left in electoral politics?
Just big
in
picture.
General?
Activism electorally, just domestically, but, of big picture domestically.
It's a good question. I mean, I think we're going through a serious moment of transition in which the two Sanders campaigns, I think, have demonstrated to a lot of people that electoral change is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, within the U.S. context, because then also you have the consequences of, Trump's presidency and now Biden's presidency, both of which I find catastrophic for working people. And so I think that there is an increasing both interest in leftism and political mobilization around leftist causes. At the same time, there is a lack of viable infrastructure in the sense of developed parties, unions, a kind of culture of the left, which you do have. I spent a lot of time in France, and you have that in a country like France, where you have, even on TV shows, you have people debating politics, and there are Marxists who are on TV. Of course, you'd never have that on CNN or anything like that. And so one of the most important struggles is to build up that infrastructure so that we have much more cultural, political, labor-based infrastructure for a kind of culture of the left. And I do think that we're headed in that direction. I think there are some very positive signs on that front. I also think that reality is on our side. One of the great quotes from Michael Parenti that I often reference is, he said, the problem with the ruling class that they've always had is that reality is radical, because reality makes people radical. Reality is homelessness and downward mobility and, stagnant wages and all the shit that working class people have to deal with. And given that reality is radical, people are increasingly looking for and getting involved in alternative modes of organizing. And that's extremely promising. And that's one of the reasons that there's so much propaganda being pumped out, both in order to try to funnel people into the Democratic Party and its machine, or further to the right, simply to funnel people into fascist modes of organizing through all the anti-China propaganda, all the anti-Russia propaganda, and things like this. And it's another reason that we need a real kind of cultural power in order to direct people in a different direction, to identify who their real enemies are. The real enemies aren't Russians or Chinese people. The real enemies are the capitalist ruling class who are producing propaganda that are telling them that the Russians and the Chinese are the real enemies, or the Mexican immigrants, or, there's lots of other potential enemies, the black people, et cetera, et cetera.
So, do you think we'll see an end to the American empire in our lifetimes?
I think it's very possible. Depends on how long we live, and depends on how good we are at organizing.
Okay.
But I think that one of the single most important things for people to understand, and it took me a long time to understand this, is that an enormous part of the capitalist cultural apparatus, right, the system of culture in the United States that beams out and dominates the airwaves so much that 90% of what all US Americans see and hear is produced by 5 mega corporations, right, that produce the news and also produce all of the entertainment. That one of the principal things that they do is project U.S. power and U.S. exceptionalism, telling us that the U.S. is the greatest country on earth, the most powerful military, the most developed economy, on and on and on, so much so that people can't even see very basic things. Like the U.S. has lost an innumerable number of its military interventions. It's backing the Ukraine, and it cannot win that war. It has not, as of yet, been able to win that war in the way that the U.S. administration wanted to win that war. Afghanistan was a debacle. Iraq was it's quote unquote successfully, toppled the Saddam Hussein, but has turned the country has caused enormous problems within the country. The U.S. empire has not been able to overthrow Cuba. They've not been able to overthrow China. They have been able to overthrow a country like Grenada, a very small socialist country. In that regard, people have to recognize that even at the military level, the U.S. empire, since Vietnam for that matter, a moment in time at which barefoot peasants handed a resounding defeat to the U.S. empire, right? We have to be able to see through the power projection of the U.S. empire and recognize not only that it's fragile, but that its history has been marked by a whole series of losses, and those losses have been victories for working people around the world. And so the world is changing very, very quickly. The COVID crisis was a good example of it, with more than 1 million deaths in the United States and all of the economic consequences from that. And Lenin famously said that there are, I'm paraphrasing here, decades where almost nothing happens and weeks where decades happen. Our moment in time resembles.
Wait, when did John say that?
Lenin.
I was trying to make a joke. Sorry.
Oh, John? Wait, who's John?
No, you said Lenin said that, and I was like, oh wait, when did John say that?
Oh God,
I do. Yeah.
God. Okay, sorry, I'm slow on the uptake there. And I think that our moment, at least as of late, has been a moment in which things are changing very rapidly in the world. And so it gives it's a promising moment for continuing to build power in the direction of dismantling the U.S. empire.
I hope you are right. I hope you are right. So in closing here, where can people go to learn more about you and your work and the workshops and everything that you have going on?
Well, I try to keep my work up to date on my website, gabrielrockhill.com. The critical theory workshop information is on my website, or people can search it in the search engine. I'm on Twitter. I'm not as active as some, but I am there. Those are probably some of the main go-to spots, I guess.
Right on. Dr. Rockhill, thank you so much for doing this. I always love your input and could talk to you all day, and I really appreciate you doing the show.
Thanks for having me on. Thanks for the great work that you're doing, and keep it up. Appreciate it.
That was Professor Gabriel Rockhill. Check out his website, gabrielrockhill.com. Also, music for the 1000 podcast is provided by Andrew Saxena. Be sure to check out his podcast, Baywatching Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. I said podcast an awful lot in that sentence, didn't I? Please leave us a 5-star review if you would be so kind. That really helps us out an awful lot. And if you want to support this show on the sustainability end, you can become a patron over at patreon.com/romplacone. For a Give What You Can level, you get all kinds of exclusive content, and I will make you a theme song, and you get the 1000 bonus podcast where Andrew and myself talk about the 1000 podcast, give some behind-the-scenes updates, and we also go through the 1000 challenges that people leave. So that's a really fun podcast. We just dropped the first one. You can become part of that over at patreon.com/romplacone for a Give What You Can level. All right, that was number 10. Number 10, we have officially made it to double digits. We only have 990 more to go. It's going really fast. I got to say, it's been going fast. I've already had dreams where I accidentally say the wrong number in an episode, which I'm sure will probably happen at some point. Now, I'll just re-record it. Hopefully, I'll catch it in time. But yeah, already having dreams where that happens. Double digits. We did it. See you next week. Hey guys, Ron Placone here. Take your own 1000 challenge. No, you don't need to interview 1,000 people, although if you want to do that, go for it. Your 1000 challenge can be whatever you want. Maybe you want to call a friend out of the blue once a week. Maybe you want to read a book every month. Maybe you want to start a different garden every season. I guess that might be dependent on where you live. Look, the point of the challenge is taking on an endeavor that enriches your life in some way, and it can be measured. And then, of course, you do it regularly. That's what 1000 is doing for me, and hopefully for you too. The main reason for this podcast and every podcast I've ever done is to build community. So take your own challenge. Then join our Facebook group. It's called 1000 What's Your Challenge? ? That's 1000 What's Your Challenge ? And post about what your 1000 challenge is and the progress you're making. All I ask is that people be encouraging of each other's challenges. This is personal and vulnerable, so be cool. There's enough negativity on social media. We don't need to add to it. For those of you who aren't on Facebook, hopefully in the future we'll be expanding to places like Discord, Reddit, but for now, we're starting on Facebook. And again, that Facebook group is called 1000 What's Your Challenge? See you there.